So we go from that.
So welcome to the group one for and Albert. I know. In this microphone, but I'm not using it. Can we just start over? Okay. Welcome to the book launch for Child of the Melon by Max Turner. That's you. Max Turner writes SF, speculative fiction, furry fiction, many subgenres of horror, and LGBTQ+ romance and erotica. More often than not, he writes combinations thereof. Max has written several queer novellas, and his short stories have been published both online and in print. He's also the publisher of A Coup of Owls, quarterly online and print anthologies. I'm Heather Valentine. I'm a queer Scottish writer. I write fantasy and horror short fiction. So, Max, would you like to start us with a reading?
If I don't fall off this one, it's very precarious. It could happen. I'm gonna start with the start of the book. It's at the beginning, so it feels like a good place to start. So this is 1961. And I'm not doing any voices or accents because I can't. So, show yourself. Sheriff Williams' voice strained with frustration and anger as he held his gun and torch together, pointing at the tree line. The snow had fallen heavily the day before, and there were no fresh tracks that he could see, but there was definitely something at the edge of the woods. When he had taken the call, he had expected it to be nothing, just someone's overactive imagination, but there was something. James Williams didn't want to be out on a night like this. With the first snow falling, there was already enough to do. A few more days of snowfall at this rate, and their time would be cut off for the winter a little earlier than usual. This year, the mayor had proposed some measures to keep the high road and the bridge out of town clear, but they still needed to prepare for their potential and usual isolation if it didn't work. With that and the rights situation, and the recent infestation of rodents overrunning the town, Williams had better shit to do than chasing down what was likely a bobcat at most. The shrubbery rustled and he cocked his gun. Then he heard a pitiful voice, barely more than a quiet sob. Sheriff? Through fog that fell heavily about the town, no matter the time of year, Williams saw a small boy staggering from the edge of the woods. He was dressed in pajamas, torn by the rough foliage. His skin pale, eyes rimmed so red and raw that it was visible even in the growing darkness of the early winter evening. His bare feet were muddy and covered in cuts and bruises. Williams hesitated a moment before he uncocked and holstered his gun and started forward, picking up speed as he saw the child start to stumble. He caught him and cradled the limp and exhausted form as the child struggled to regulate his breathing. His eyes were wide with terror and sadness. Bobby Taylor? Williams recognized the sickly little kid as that of Bill Taylor, a local drunk. A quiet kid, from what he knew, kept to himself. He always went to and from school on his own, smaller than most kids his age and a bit of a loner. He was the kind of kid that Williams kept an eye on. He'd probably just become a drunk like his old man, was what most people thought. No one expected Bobby to do better than the family he came from. But he wasn't trouble. He was quiet and polite to a fault, the kind of politeness that was beaten into a kid. He was the last person James had expected to see out here, alone at the edge of the woods, while he was responding to reports of strange noises that seemed to have the nearest residents terrified. The others, Bobby mumbled, quietly shaking in his arms, despite feeling burning hot. The kid seemed sick, maybe from walking in the woods at night and barely a stitch. I can't feel them anymore. The music's gone. Others? The children. The other children. Bobby's breath stuttered against a sob. They're gone. I couldn't keep up. He left me behind. He took the music away. The tears came. Williams got to his feet, holding the boy to his chest. He carried him back to his vehicle. He had no clue what the hell was going on. His first thought had been that little Bobby had gotten into his daddy's liquor, but he didn't smell of alcohol. Maybe he was sickening for something, delirious. The low light of the headlamps, and the static-coloured lights on the roof lit the way as Williams walked towards his truck. Frantic chatter on the radio becoming apparent. He frowned, making out the voice of the dispatcher as he got closer, feeling his pulse spike as he heard the panic and urgency of her tone. "Sheriff, please come in, Sheriff." She was pleading over and over. Williams picked up the pace, opened the door awkwardly, and slid Bobby gently into the passenger seat before grabbing the CV. The wire strained as he pressed the receiver. "This is Williams." "Sheriff, oh God, please, you've got to get back here." Okay, slow down. What's going on?" He looked down at Bobby, who had curled it into a ball like the smallest 10-year-old in the world at that moment. "James, the children, they're all gone." The words broke on a sob. "What children?" James growled, frustrated and confused and not getting answers damn well fast enough. "All of them. All the children from the town. They're all gone, James. Oh God, they're all gone. The calls, the phone is ringing off the hook. Someone has taken all the children." The words trailed off into some more sobs, and Williams felt a shiver so cold grip him that he couldn't help the uncharacteristic shudder that took hold of his body. He looked down at Bobby, who curled even tighter around his middle, and let out a chilling sob. That was the beginning.
Thank you for reading for us. So to start, I suppose we'll start with an introduction. So what is Childhood Film and how did you come to write it?
It's a book. Sorry, I'm sorry. So it's a queer retelling. It's not a modern retelling because it's actually primarily set in the 80s, but modern, in quotation marks, retelling of the Pied Piper of Hamelin fairy tale. And I guess I kind of came to write it because it was just something that I hadn't seen. There's a lot of sort of fairy tale retellings, and I've never seen this, and it was one that I actually had in my bookshelf as a kid, and I hated it. It was quite scary, you know, and I had like the little, I don't know, penguin edition or whatever it was on my bookshelf as a kid, and it just always kind of stayed with me as sort of like this really scary story. And I like a scary story. So it felt like a good sort of, it was something right for a reapproach. And pretty much everything I write is queer. It's like accidental. It's not accidental, it's incidental. It's just it happens. So it just kind of went from there and grew into this sort of the story of Bobby, the kid that was left behind, and sort of focusing on him and what happens to him in the original fairy tale. There is one child that's left behind, and that's how the townsfolk kind of find out that all the kids have been stolen and where they've gone, because there's the one kid that couldn't keep up and wants to tell his story.
So it seems like you originally conceived of it as a fairy tale retelling. So what is it that interests you about fairy tale retellings, particularly queer retellings? It's one of those weird things, because I actually am one of these people that I wouldn't say I kind of say, oh, you shouldn't remake things, or you shouldn't reimagine things and things like that, you know, but I do understand that people do get sick of it, you know, in media. You sort of see, you know, why not make something original instead of a new, you know, I don't know, more sequels or prequels or retellings or what have you. But I think with fairy tales, it's kind of different because they're stories that are meant to be interpreted in different ways. You know, they're sort of, in a way, parables. And I think that you can interpret them through a modern lens and a queer lens. And, you know, there's different ways to look at them now and kind of see, oh, it's telling this story, but that also applies to this now, you know, in our modern society. You know, it kind of, you know, the othering
that happens in some of them, the monsters that are in some of them. You know, we can see that in different media now, and it sort of feels like I said, it's kind of ripe for exploration, and it doesn't feel like, oh, you're just doing another, you know, another retelling of a popular story. You know.
So one of the things that I find quite unique about Children of Melon is the setting, the town of Elk Pass, which I really like. So this, with the small town corruption and claustrophobia of a town that could just be cut off by snow, much like we're all worried is going to happen when we leave this place tonight. So is it based off of places you're familiar with? What are some real or fictional small towns that inspired you or that you researched?
Well, I grew up in a small town in England, not one of those kind of, well, actually it's a village. It's not one of those sort of twee kind of like pretty Cotswolds kind of places. It's a coastal village, but it's actually not. It's on a tidal river. So it sort of has the feel of it being a seaside town without it being on the seaside. And actually it was back in its heyday in like the sort of early 1900s, 1920s, 30s, 40s, it was actually a tourist location. People used to go there for a holiday from other parts of England. And so I kind of always grew up in this sort of small town thing, or a small town mentality, and never failing, which at the time when I was younger, it was quite upsetting. You know, I was one of the first people in my village to go to university, and then that kind of othered me because people were just like, "Oh, you know, it's too snobby for us now," or whatever. I was like, "No, I'm just getting an education." So it was a kind of the idea of being somebody other in a small community is something that I personally grew up with. And I think that also being a product, you know, being a child of the 80s, showing my age now, but being a child of the 80s and growing up with the things like E.T. and Back to the Future and just all these kind of like really big 1980s media of like television and film, mostly out of America, well, pretty much exclusively out of America, that are set in small towns. And then sort of growing up and kind of getting into things like Twin Peaks and, you know, and sort of seeing that kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, you know, sometimes really weird. And I think I just sort of, because of my own experiences, I did develop this sort of fascination with those kind of kooky, small town America type things. And I'm pretty sure that absolutely every small town that we've seen any fictionalization on television or film are completely that, just absolute fiction. Like I don't know that, you know, that there's anywhere quite like Erie, Indiana, and like all these other places. You know, I think that that is just true celluloid treatment. But that's, you know, the only reference we've got is like, you know, British observers of America. But yeah, it sort of it opened up this fascination for me. And I think actually a lot of my stories end up then sort of set in these kind of quirky little strange towns or strange communities. And it, you know, it sort of lends itself to this because it kind of, for one thing, it does feel like it's a story that needs to happen in a small town. But also, I wanted it to be a town that is cut off and kind of feasibly cut off. So like it now, you're like, well, what am I? And just dig them out. It's fine. I got it. Like just put some salt down. Whereas like in the 80s, you know, it's like, you know, I'm thinking about sort of like the kind of place you see in places like Alaska and things like that, where you're like, and you know, up in Canada as well, where you're just like, oh no, like you literally are just going to be completely isolated for a few months. And you know, and you still do get that these days up in Alaska. I know because I watched Ice Road Truckers. But as my research, but I think it's that kind of that appeal of just that these strange places that maybe do or don't exist in America, and so it felt like, okay, well, this could exist. This place could exist. Probably not, you know, with what happens in this mode. I don't know. It depends on how much you believe in fairy tales. There you go.
So the events that happen behind the mystery of Elk Pass unfold over a few decades, and they're tied together by Bobby's relationship with his mentor and father figure James, who we all met as a point of view character in the prologue. So I love the kind of the warmth of James's care for Bobby is kind of thread throughout the book. So I was wondering what interested you in writing their relationship and in writing. You've already mentioned you grew up in the 80s, but part of what kind of attracted you to writing across the 60s and 80s like that?
Yeah, I think like specifically the relationship with Bobby, I think that just to be able to tell this story, Bobby needed to become somebody, he needed to, but if he's the child that's got left behind, and there needs to be a reason why he's left behind, he's a neglected child, physically could not keep up with the other kids. So then kind of, I was like, well, then he can't be the Tangler. He can't turn into his own dad. He needs to have something more in his life to be able to be central to this story. And just, yeah, from that initial sort of opening of kind of going, okay, well, through the events that tie them together in that first night, that's when James then, let's say, essentially becomes a father figure to him and becomes his mentor, and then he ends up becoming a deputy himself. And I think that it was just really important that he needed to have that grounding, because I think that, and I think he can still be other. I think, and in a way, it's almost like a juxtaposition of like, you can still be other, even though you have somebody, you're not sort of alone. He is mostly a loner, but he's not completely alone. He's not unloved. He's not unwanted. But he is still other. He's not like James, but he's trying to be, he's sort of trying to not be his dad. And I think he needs somebody like James in his life. So it kind of felt like that worked. And then just because of being able to kind of tell the story and wanting to set it in the 80s, I was like, well, I need to then push it back in time. It needs to have grounding in that initial event, both to kind of be able to be sort of true to the actual fairy tale, to be able to tell the scope of that, because obviously you need to start off with the child that's left behind. And I didn't want to be like, oh, okay, so 20 years ago, this kid was left behind, and now here's his story. It needed to kind of have that actually happen. And then that, enabled the whole story with James to kind of come into it as well. So it just kind of had to be in the 60s, really.
So before we start talking about the book's other major relationship, I believe you wanted to do a reading to kind of lead us into it.
Mm-hmm, sure. 1 second. So just for a bit of context, this is later in the book. And Bobby is now grown. He's now the deputy sheriff. And he's checking out, so the snow is imminent, and he's checking out an abandoned property that generally nobody goes near, but he's seen a light on, so he's going to go and check out this abandoned property on the edge of town. Okay. And just again, for the context, Buck is his dog. He has a dog called Buck. This will become important when I say Bobby ruffled Buck's fur. The dog, now in the passenger seat rather than in his usual place in the back. It was dark and cold, snow thick about them, and Buck's breath fogged the air as his tongue rolled out. Bobby smiled. Don't worry, buddy. This is only a marginally terrible idea. Buck whined as Bobby drove through the near impenetrable snow. It was slow going as he headed for the edge of town. He had grabbed the address from the town records. Randall Allen now lived with some older relatives in their apparent care, an old aunt or something, someone who took care of him at his father's behest rather than him being placed in an institute. Bobby had considered it to be gossip until he pulled the address information and found notes on the file. She had power of attorney and was listed as his caretaker. It was on the outskirts of town, though not as far as the Allens' property. He had to drive past the Wrights' house. Bobby was just passing the end of Firebug Lane. when he noticed lights and movement on the top floor of the not too distant house. Fuck, he muttered, and Buck whined again. He slowed and made a wide turn to head down the lane towards the abandoned house. Just a quick detour, he told the dog, patting his head. Better check out what's going on here. He wondered about stupid kids or cold tramps being stranded in a dead old house in this weather. He pulled up outside the house, as close as he could get to the front door, and slid out of the car. The cold punched the air out of him, the wind now bringing the snow in quick and sideways. 10 minutes. He'd give himself 10 minutes at most, no matter what he found. He needed to check on Randall, and then he wasn't sure. He just knew it was what James would do. What would happen once he found the man? He couldn't say. The short path from the drive was overgrown and obscured by snow. He picked his way through the brambles hidden by the whiteness to the front of the huge house. It wasn't technically derelict, but portions of it had been boarded up. Bobby ruminated on how strange it was that he had never much heard the name Wrights before, that he had never known any history of this property, that no one ever talked about it, as though it had been abandoned 100 years ago and faded into the history of the town. He tried the front door expecting nothing, surprised when it opened. It was heavy and stiff, but didn't take long to open it enough to shoulder inside out of the snow, even as some of it drifted through with him. Bobby pulled out his torch and turned it on, the steady beam of it catching the dust in the air. He swept it over the foyer, noting the size, the location of the stairs, the furniture covered in sheets. As he took a step forward into the mausoleum of the house, the torch began to flicker. He tapped it a couple of times, but the beam flickered again and then went out. Shit, he muttered, turning it off and on again to no avail. That was when he heard the click of shoes on once polished wood flooring. The sound echoed for a moment, making it hard to tell its direction at first, and Bobby found his heart starting to race. It didn't sound like the shuffle of a tramp or the scampering of teens. He put one hand on his holster, flicking the catch and ready to draw. Hello, who's there? He called, the words bouncing off the walls in a way that was more eerie than he would have liked. A glow of light appeared at on the landing of the floor above, leaking through to the top of the stairs and getting brighter as it approached. Bobby felt a strange shiver over his entire body, a vulnerable feeling of being seen when he wanted to hide. The light grew closer and brighter until he could make out it was a lamp held by a dark figure. The figure was little more than a black shape. Bobby was blinded by the bright lamp and unable to see clearly. It came to a stop at the top of the stairs, and Bobby knew it was looking down on him. He felt like prey and fought the urge to run. Instead, he was rooted to the spot, trapped by equal parts fear and curiosity. Fear of something overwhelming, a sense of something strange and familiar, not of the figure. The realization hit him hard and he swallowed, his mouth dry. Bobby opened it to speak, but was cut off before any words had chance to stumble out. His radio crackled to life, and the dispatcher's concerned tone was clear, even if the signal itself was distorted by the snow. Deputy Taylor, please respond. We have, I don't know, reports of vermin, rats. Bobby, there's something going on up near the woods. I'm getting all kinds of crazy reports. Bobby, can you hear me? The line crackled a little more, but Bobby found himself watching that unmoving lamp, stock still despite wanting to move. I've got all kinds of reports about giant rats. They're coming out of the snow, hundreds of them. Bobby, people are starting to panic. Bobby, Bobby! The figure started towards him.
So the other major relationship in Sheridan Realm is the one between Bobby and the Piper. So I was really compelled by Bobby's yearning for the hole the Piper left in his life when he left behind, the way he felt left behind when other people saw him as being spared something. Piper manipulates him, but also sees Bobby as the only person that could possibly understand him. Could you talk to me about writing the push and pull of that relationship?
Yeah, I think it's just like this idea of, again, going back to the idea of being othered and of being seen by somebody else. And and it's not, you sort of find out as the book goes on, maybe it's not as clear cut as him just not being able to keep up. And so I'm trying not to spoil it, no spoilers. It's about seeing he feels something. It's not just about being left behind for him. He felt something very deeply. He talks about the music, and obviously in the original fairy tale, that's what led. That's the pipe. Piping his pipes. And so there's that connection there with the sort of almost like siren-like, in that way. But actually, as the story goes on, you realize that connection isn't necessarily about, oh, the music was hypnotizing and I was following the music. It was actually just as much about following the piper. And so there's a connection there that means something to him that maybe he doesn't even really understand himself to a great extent, and especially not until he's an adult. So I think like with their relationship, because it becomes about being seen by somebody else, but obviously the piper has his reasons, but could be described as not a good person. I mean, it's one of those things, like, it's somebody truly bad if they've got a good reason for it. That's again then kind of at odds with Bobby being the deputy sheriff. So that their relationship has to have that element of being, like say, sort of pushing forward and kind of the sort of two sides of something really. And read on to see what Bobby does.
So I suppose talking about the themes of the book, we'll try not to talk about specifics. It's difficult, but we're doing our best. So we're talking about falling in love with monsters. Queer writers are often interested in dark fairy tales, gothic stories, and monsters, both literal and metaphorical, either as a way to reclaim what we've been called or just because the darkness is alluring. So what is it that drew you to kind of writing this kind of dark fairy tale and to writing sort of cannibal villains and inhuman love interests?
I love that, like, inhuman love interests.
That was the least spoilery way I could phrase it.
No, I love it. It's like that's like the PG way of saying monster fuckers. And I love it. I think I'm going to use that. And I just, I've watched my horror is queer t-shirt because it's apt. I think you're right. It's like this idea of, I think it's ingrained in horror again because there's that otherness in horror, and horror is where we mostly see monsters, other than in fairy tales. And I don't know. I think it comes down to this like this Tumblr meme. Like there's two kinds of people in the world: those that prefer the Beast and those that prefer Prince Adam. I prefer the Beast, and I think that, and that's in Disney's Beauty and the Beast. And yeah, I think that it is about the othering of people, and are we the monsters, and yeah, let's reclaim that, but also being seen by other monsters, being seen by people that are also other, and it, definitely as a queer person, that's something that has always been ingrained. It's like you are other, but that's not necessarily good. Like now I'll say like I'm other, and otherness is cool, and being weird is fine, and and I think that's great. But that's not always been the case, and it's not always everybody's attitude even today. And I sort of think about the idea of queering of villains, and sort of like actually having queer coded villains, and this goes back to old Hollywood and old times, but the purposely the villains were portrayed to be queer to kind of show their deviance, and that these are not good people because they're very queer on the screen, and I think that is something that sort of people have been reclaiming over recent years, and there's lots of really great books out there where like the queer villain is actually not the good guy, but is the protagonist, or you know, is actually the point of the story rather than it being queerness being used to mark somebody as deviant or wrong, bad, what have you. So I think that, yeah, I think generally as a queer person, I'm drawn to that, to exploring that, what the nature of that is. And I think that that kind of opens itself to be explored in lots of different ways in fiction. You know, if you are fiction bent, you know, if you are a writer, it's something that, you know, you might explore in different ways. And I've explored it in different ways, from sort of, you know, from this kind of more sort of PG kind of way.
Are we going to talk about the monster fucking?
Yeah, we're going to try
No, if he doesn't talk about the monster fucking group, this is where you prompt him.
So I also have a collection of short stories that came out in the autumn last year, and it's called Queered, and it's all the stories feature trans masculine characters, and they're all erotic short stories. With a variety of different lovers. Some are also trans-masc, others trans feminine, cis characters, non-binary. So there's quite a range there, but there's sort of something other about each of them. So, you know, so some of the most sedate is like, you know, a couple of witches and a bit of power going on. Through to like the last I left the egg preg until the very last story so that people could just stop there. They were like, oh, I don't know, tentacles in this story. Oh, the next one's got egg preg. Okay, I think I'm just gonna stop there. So yeah, I wanted to kind of just put together that collection to just kind of, I didn't see a lot of it out there. I was just like, who doesn't want some monster fucking with trans people, you know? So I thought, yeah, I'm gonna do that. The book, not literally. But yeah, I think that again, like that's just another way in which I'm sort of exploring, you know, how can a writer explore these things? And you know, some of those stories, for example, like the transness is incidental, the characters just happen to be trans or non-binary or whatever. And in others, it's like actually really important to the story and important to the otherness of that story. And I think that again that kind of relates back to this is that although there's, you know, trans characters in this one, it's queer, and it is again about, you know, exploring the otherness. And there is, you know, I mean, like you can see these kind of creepy eyes, and there is a monster in this book. It doesn't get explicit, I'm afraid. But for more monster explicit fan fiction of it, they are more than welcome to. But yeah, it's so there is a monster in it. So yeah, maybe I'm falling into a niche, a niche of writing certain kinds of stories. But again, like fairy tales is such a great scope for that. At the moment, I'm working on a couple of other novellas at the moment, and one of them is a queer retelling of Beauty and the Beast, but it's much more kind of Shrek than Beauty and the Beast. I don't mean in comedy or in sort of like but in terms of like, you know, it is the goal to become human, or is the goal to make your lover also a beast, you know? And it's so yeah, that's it's quite dark. It's sort of historical fairy tale, historical, you know, not necessarily real historical. So I'm working on that at the moment. And yeah, I'm kind of writing myself into a I'm writing another one about serial killers.
And it all comes back to Hannibal eventually.
I know, this is it. It's like a big influence on my life. No, true story. I do love Hannibal, and there is elements of that in here, along with every 80s thing that I ever watched, and a variety of other, actually Stranger Things. I really loved what they did with their look at 80s small town. I mean, that was captivating. I really love that aesthetically, and yeah, there's definitely a bit of a Twin Peaks element in there as well. So it's yeah, there's a lot of those influences. But definitely I will say like Hannibal, I actually as a show, I owe a lot of my queer growth to Hannibal. I was actually talking about this earlier in the family lives that I started to realize that I may not be cis when and at a point, and actually I was very good friends, or I am still very good friends with a lot of people in that fandom, and it was queer people in that fandom that really helped me, and I was just like, oh, I think I'm trans, and sort of went from there. That's many years ago now, but it's always stayed in my heart. And you know and again, I think that because there was a thing there about otherness and being seen and being loved for who you are, you know, being seen for who you are and loved for it, even if it isn't the mainstream idea of what a person should be, or like the acceptable idea of what a person should be. I'm not advocating for cannibalism, no, that's
I am.
okay. Are you hungry? But yeah, yeah, I think that there's a lot to be said for just influences. I think as a writer, you know, it's not. I think with writing in general, is it's not an individual sport. Do you know what I mean? It's like we are the sum of our influences. That's how we create anything. And some things come through more than others, and certain things you just take it along with it. So yeah, I think in general, exploring otherness, and sometimes that involves most of everything.
Sometimes.
Sometimes. Unfortunately, not all the time. Sometimes we need a break.
Yeah. So on the note of taking a break, I'm going to open to questions from the audience here or online, if anyone has any.
No pressure. So you in the back.
If you're writing that kind of material, where's the best place to go publish?
So for the people that are online, if you're writing that kind of material, being gay monster erotica, where's the best kind of place to publish it?
No, it's definitely a niche. So a lot of small presses, you know, I as somebody who runs a small press myself, I cannot support them enough. I think that there's so much out there from independent presses that they take a risk that a lot of mainstream would never. You know, like it's just even just this book, you know, and big shout out to my Night Press because it's, you know, it's one of those things that if I put this to, you know, penguins, then you know it's stuff that isn't going to get anywhere. And I think that they're much more open in general to queerness, to exploring different identities, and supporting authors that are not the mainstream. You know, because despite the moanings of people online about how like cis straight white middle-aged men find it so hard to get published these days, despite still being like over 85% of published mainstream authors. The great thing with the independent presses is they do champion the little guy. You know, that is usually their bread and butter for the vast majority of them. So I think that's a good place to start. With Queered, I actually self-published that one, and that was because it actually came about because I think the vast majority of the stories in that collection, I can't remember how many should know, shouldn't I? 12? I don't know, 13, 14, I don't know, it's a few. The vast majority of them I've actually submitted to various different calls for anthologies and different publications and didn't really get anywhere. And I think that was because they were either I was submitting to like trans focused calls and they were kind of like, this doesn't quite fit. I'm like, that's what he said. Sorry. Sorry. Oh. And then others that were kind of a bit more open, and they'll be like, oh, we accept explicit rated material, but it has to forward the plot or whatever, and mine usually does. I think that most of it is not all gratuitous. But it just didn't really make it. And I think the only couple that I really got published was a couple of furry fiction in a publication that I feel like might actually be out of print. And it's called Oh Moon. And for those not into furry things, which actually I'm not in the furry community at all, furries being people that dress in the fursuits, the
Anthropomorphized animals.
I have friends that do it. I do not. It looks like fun. But the Omer is a furry publication. Very sex positive, very kink positive. Very much comes with a label on the front, warning kind of thing. And so I did get a couple of furry stories published in a couple of issues of those. But yeah, it's quite niche, and I think, and I do recommend sometimes, maybe self-publishing is the way to go. With mine, it was just because I had all these stories laying around. There wasn't like, nobody was like, no. So I thought, well, okay, well, I'll just put them into a collection myself. And so far, so good. People seem to be enjoying it. I ran a Kickstarter for it just to help with some of the costs, and that was really successful. Clearly tapped into something there with some people. So yeah.
All right. Do we have any other questions from the audience here or online? Okay, I'll come up with one then. Okay. Bill, shoot.
There's a market that for how much do you think fandom has recently been popular media and book series?
For those of you watching online, there's currently a sort of queer renaissance in terms of publishing of original fiction. The question is, how much do you think fandom, particularly of recent shows like Hannibal that have a very queer fandom, how do you think that's affected it?
I love that you called Hannibal a recent show. Just because it ended 10 years ago.
I'm 32 years old, it's difficult.
But no, absolutely. And you've got, Our Flag Means Death. There are more queer shows, and I think that and the one that I haven't got around to watching yet, the Interview with the Vampire one, which all I've seen is GIFs on Tumblr. I'm like, I need to watch this show. But yeah, I think that it is like a bit of a circle with that, because I think that there generally is more representation in mainstream media, and there's certainly, I think, more being published than there was. But I think that because of like the rise as well in independent publishing, both on a personal level and with small presses, tends to, in my experience, and it could just be that I've fallen again into a niche and I can't get out, but tend to be very queer led, very, very much either focused on queer stories or run by queer people. But no, I think that there is an aspect of fandom that comes into it, in the sense that there's always been people that get things published because they sort of started off in fandom and whatever. There's famous. I say famous, I can't remember her name.
Tanzania.
Oh yeah, but also there was somebody who was in back many years ago, when LiveJournal was where we all lived for fandom. There was like a huge thing with the Harry Potter fandom, and like one of the huge
Cassandra Clare.
Yeah. So she started off in there, and now so I think she was one of the first ones to kind of break away from it, and then obviously thank you. Yeah, the 50 Shades of Grey ones. So there is, there is that happens at mainstreams, but I think actually there are more people out there doing that than get published in the mainstream, and so invariably get published by independent presses. And I think that also I mean, because I'm quite heavily into fandom. So I would say in my many years in fandom, there has been a shift as well in people's attitudes towards writing, towards original publishing, but also I mean, there's always been this thing of scrubbing fiction or filing off serial numbers, we used to call it many years ago. So that's always existed, but I do feel like there is much more, what's the word, but sort of like confidence in doing that now. It feels like there's a lot more authors that come through fandom that are just like, well, I'm just going to go and do this, whereas I think before it was, people just didn't have necessarily the nerve to do it. I've always kind of written original stuff alongside fandom, so it wasn't something that I kind of made that sort of, it wasn't a challenge for me. Whereas I know like people, when I first started in fandoms, it wasn't a thing. And I think part of that is the actual change in attitude towards fan fiction and towards fan art as well. But the idea that it used to be very much berated, it used to be very much like, oh, that's, that's what, bored housewives do or whatever. And it was just like, it was very, people spoke about it very derogatory. In a very derogatory way. But I think that over the last sort of 5-10 years, and especially with people being more open, so actually like original writers, people that appear to be original only writers actually coming out and going, well, actually, I still write fan fiction and I publish it on AO, but I'm not going to show you my name. I think that that's given people, it's kind of taken away that idea of like, oh, this is subpar fiction, because it's not. I mean, like you read some of it and you're just like, oh my God, this is better than anything James Patterson has read. They're very excited. I do hate him. I'm sorry. He's the front of a lot of my jokes, but he deserves it. So anyway.
It's okay. I know you've been reading my fan fiction, and it's all sublime and better than anything James Patterson has ever written. All right. So, do we have any more questions from the audience? Well, I suppose so. Are there any sort of, I don't know, final words you want to say about Child of the Melon, your cold winter horror novella?
It feels very fitting tonight.
Yeah.
Here's my chicken. No, I hope that everyone enjoys it. And I hope that you kind of feel something from it, and I think that and again, I'm just going to keep on saying it goes back to being othered. But it is. I think that there's I think it's a strange story with an element of romance that is kind of weird. But that hopefully makes you feel something, that makes you kind of feel like, okay, that I can be a weirdo and still find another weirdo and it'll be okay. So yeah, I think that's it really.
Yeah, okay. Thank you all for coming. I don't know if you want to take over from here.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for watching online as well.